Доброго вечора усім. Дуже раді бачити такі світлі, розумні, рідні і незнайомі обличчя сьогодні на лекції, яка є останньою у межах програми «Різноманіття». Програма «Різноманіття» створена Освітнім центром з прав людини у Львові у партнерстві з трьома важливими партнерськими організаціями. Це Львівська бізнес-школа, Львівський медіафорум і компанія SoftServe Incorporated. Це програма, головною метою якої є продемонструвати суспільству загалом і бізнесу, зокрема, що таке різноманіття, які вигоди і користі, повага до різноманіття, повага до інакшості, до різних соціальних груп приносить кожному і кожній зокрема, але і компаніям у вигляді 10% загалом. У нас сьогодні рок-зірка світової і європейської, зокрема, неурядової сфери. Це Сильвія Борен, і перш ніж її представити, я розкажу, як ми з нею познайомилися. Наприкінці минулого року команда освітнього центру їздила з освітньою мандрівкою до Нідерландів. Ми відвідали Амстердам, Утрехт і Гаагу. І наші колеги з Нідерландів настільки постарались, там було просто 3 групи організаторів, що вони змагалися між собою, хто більше програм навчальних для нас організує. Тому у нас не було практично часу якось погуляти по місту, скористатися усіма принадами Амстердаму. І коли ми йшли на вечерю з пані Сильвією приблизно на 8:30, ми були достатньо втомлені і мало вмотивовані бачитися зі ще однією персоною з Нідерландів. Однак, коли ми вийшли з цієї вечері, ми про пані Сильвію говорили ще кілька місяців після того. Тому що це жінка, яка дуже надихає, це жінка з величезною історією, з великою кількістю стресів світового масштабу, які довелося пережити, і при цьому всьому вона проста і усміхнена. Я думаю, що і ви ще кілька місяців після сьогоднішньої лекції будете згадувати пані Сильвію, і, можливо, для когось вона стане справжньою рольовою моделлю. А тепер у нас сигнал для початку трансляції. Я мушу згадати про наших партнерів. Відтак готуйтеся аплодувати. Дуже дякуємо за фінансову підтримку Національному демократичному інституту зі Сполучених Штатів Америки. Також дякуємо уряду Швеції, платницям податків у тій скандинавській державі. Дякуємо Центру міської історії за гостинність. Львівській міській раді також дякуємо, і дякуємо тим людям, які прибули сюди з Луцька, а також, я точно знаю, дивляться нас щонайменше у Вінниці, Одесі та Києві. Ось, трансляція запущена, і тепер бурхливими, гучними оплесками вітаємо Сильвія Борен.
Thank you very much. You will have to wave at me if I start speaking too quickly, because I'm Dutch-born but was brought up in New Zealand, so I'm a native English speaker, and we all know that people who speak English naturally tend to rush. So please indicate, both you as translator, thank you so much, and anybody, oops, I'm not going to fall over here. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's my very first time in Ukraine, though I've heard a lot about Ukraine from my colleagues that I work with from Governance and Integrity, who love Lviv and who love Ukraine and who get worried about Ukraine, as I think many people do, waiting for Sunday. But I will talk about my life, because I know what I've done in my life, and it's up to you to see whether it can be of any use to you. So I have made, I will give quite a long speech, just because I have quite a long life, because I'm already 68, so that's many years. And then I hope we will have time for questions and answers, or not questions and answers, but discussions about civil society and the importance of civil society. So, I was born in the Netherlands. I'm number 4 of 8 children. My father worked with Philips, and when I had 2 brothers above me and 2 brothers below me. So I always say I was brought up as a girl but also as a bit of a boy, which has been very useful in my life. And when I was 12, my father moved to New Zealand to run the Philips factory in New Zealand. So we migrated to New Zealand. So I arrived in New Zealand as a 12-year-old, not speaking English, and it was exciting, but it was also weird. And anybody who's had any migration experience as a child knows that. But I had a good time in New Zealand, and I went to university. I started in '69, so as you can see, we're talking a long time ago. And my third year at university, I'd had some boyfriends. My third year of university, I fell incredibly in love with Kathy. And anybody of you who have fallen in love know that the choice is not whether you fall in love or not. The choice is whether you're prepared to follow it up or not. And in our case, interestingly enough, we knew very little about feminism or lesbianism. I was quite young and quite naive. And we even talked about it in those first year or so, that this was possibly a temporary phase. Back then they used to talk about homosexuality as a phase you went through before you discovered real heterosexuality, real sexuality, real adult sexuality. So we actually bought into that myth and thought, well, so if I went to visit Kathy and she had a boyfriend, I would make myself scarce because she had to have the opportunity to discover her real sexuality. And she did the same until we'd been together for some time and decided this is nonsense. We began to read about feminism and about lesbianism and it being a choice that you could make. So that was all. That was all right. It was. We didn't know anybody else, and we began to tell. I think I told one of my favorite brothers first, and he got a bit of a surprise. But and we had some complication because one of my younger brothers also fell in love with Kathy, which wasn't a good idea. We had to manage that. Anyway, then I decided I didn't want to live a lie, so I told my parents. And my parents, see, we left Holland in 1963, and many migrants who leave a country actually stay of the same year when they left. So my parents were Dutch 1963 and didn't develop much beyond that. So by this time it's 72, I tell them, I have something to tell you. I want you not to tell anybody else, because Kathy did not want to tell her parents, so I'm telling you in confidence. And then I told them that I was in love with Kathy, who they knew and liked very much, and that we were wanting to have our relationship together. And what happened was that I had something like 5 months of heavy arguments, particularly with my father, but also with my mother. And all the arguments, which I don't know, some of you might still be having today. Some people still have to have these arguments today. Anyway, the end of the story was that I was studying at the university, but by this time I was teaching students as well. So I was financially independent, which is a very important part of my story. So they couldn't stop me. But the demands made on me were, I had to leave Kathy, of course. I had to stop university because it had ruined me. I had to come and live at home and be obedient as a daughter. And I had to get psychiatric treatment. This last one was quite serious. My father tried to find out whether he could get me committed in a psychiatric hospital against my will. And happily in New Zealand then that was not possible. But Kathy and I made a lot of jokes. We used to walk around the streets in Christchurch, the place where I studied, Poor Christchurch, and we used to say, if you see a man with a white coat and a needle, run. So my parents then decided that as I wasn't being obedient, they would disinherit me. So they would say to me, my mother said literally to me, I have never had a daughter called Sylvia, that name will never be sound in my house again. You will not be allowed to see your younger brother and sister anymore. Officially, we tell you that you're not allowed to see any of your family anymore. So I was 22, so I wasn't that young, but it was still very dramatic. We were a close family, and I was kicked out of that close family. I think I've always said that moment in my life, there were other things. We had a friend a woman who had had children with a man, and he was alcoholic and hopeless and violent, and then she had a relationship with a woman and had her children, and in New Zealand then her children were taken away from her and put into a home. So I thought, if society can do that to you, if you're lesbian, then I'm not going to have any children, because I don't want to be vulnerable to society like that. So I think for me, I tell this story because it was the first time in my life I had the choice, a real choice. And the choice was, am I going to do what my parents or society or everybody seems to want, or am I going to change the world? So if I want to be who I want to be, I better start changing the world to make sure that the world becomes how I want it to be. And I think that existential choice of where you stand in life comes again and again and again in your life at different moments. And for me, that was the first time, and I'm very happy about it. And I should always say that after about 2 or 3 years, I think maybe 4 years, my parents decided they couldn't stop me, and so we reconciled. I don't think they ever particularly liked my lifestyle. I don't think they totally respected it, but as one of my brothers used to say, well, they can't stop you, and at least you're doing a lot of good things. So my relationship with my parents ended up fine later, but you don't know that at the moment that all this happens. So this is the personal choice, and I've made it on being lesbian first before I began to discover what it is to be a woman and what gender means, and there's so many things I learned later. But I always say to Kathy, who I still see, and her son is my fairy godchild, and Kathy is an actress and a director in theatre, and still a wonderful and beautiful woman, and I always see her when I go to New Zealand. And I always say to Kathy, it's your fault that my life has turned out so good. So that's the first bit of the story. And I suspect all of you have had moments where you've had to make choices and have to stand up for yourself and for your own voice and for your own who you are and who you want to be. So then I'm still living in New Zealand, and this is early 70s. We've got feminism, we've got democratic movements in the West, the late 60s, early 70s, exciting time. And so I worked with the early lesbian and gay movement. I think there were only about 4 of us. We would go into schools. I'd go in with 2 guys, and one of the guys was a mountaineer with a beard, looking very macho, and was gay. And the other guy was straight, but he was quite femme. And there was me, looking like a younger version of what I look like now, a lot younger version. And we'd go into the classrooms and we'd say, who do you think is gay here? And who's straight? And they always got it wrong, of course. They always thought my macho friend was definitely hetero. And the one who was a bit femme was definitely gay. And so we explained about gender roles and about sexual orientation and sexual preference not being the same as how you look or how you present yourself, and that those choices. And we had I think it was the first demonstration in New Zealand with about 100 gays and some family, and it was a bit scary, as it can be. I've understood that, I don't know, have you had a demonstration in Lviv or in Kiev? Kiev. And I understood there were far more policemen than lesbian and gays, which is also, thank you. Am I doing all right in speed of speaking? Is it all right? Yeah? Okay, good. So, I got involved. I basically was getting involved in changing the world because I thought if I'm going to be open and out and lesbian, the world better start accepting it. And I went back to Holland, not so much to go back to Holland, but good New Zealanders. Thanks. I don't really need this. Go traveling, and I had relations back in Holland, and as you could see, at that point my relationship with my family wasn't that great, so I came in Holland, and I was here in 76 in Amsterdam when the first lesbian and gay march was held there as well. Now homosexuality was already permitted in Holland. In New Zealand we had the English law, and the English law, all countries that have been dominated by England, I was going to say, which have been English colonized by England, all had the same law, which is that male homosexuality is illegal. In New Zealand it was 7 years imprisonment, although it was hardly ever enforced, but that was, and it meant that you could get blackmailed, you could get kicked out of your job, you could get kicked out of your house. There were a lot of consequences to that. Lesbianism, women's sexuality and homosexuality did not exist. And there are two stories about that. They say it comes from Queen Victoria. There's three stories, actually. One story is when a woman marries, this is the old English, when a woman marries and she knows that it's going to be her first night and she has to undergo sex. That's how it was discussed. The advice given was, shut your eyes and think of Queen Victoria. Which suggests that it was not a very pleasant experience, I presume. Anyway, the stories that we heard about Queen Victoria, that she did not accept the existence of lesbianism, are two stories. I don't know which is historically correct. One story is that she was so anti-sexuality that she could not imagine that women would enjoy sexuality anyway. So lesbians couldn't exist because women's sexuality didn't exist. That's one story. The other story is that she was lesbian herself and thought it was better that we didn't have lesbianism being illegal. I like that story better. But as I say, I don't know the truth of this. Someone should do some historical research. Anyway, it was complicated in New Zealand already to change the law. You've got to imagine we worked towards changing the law right from 72, but heterosexuality, age of consent was 16. Homosexuality was, for men, illegal any age. Lesbianism didn't exist, so lesbianism were not criminalized. So when we wanted to change the law, in England that was going on as well. They were talking about age of consent 21, but that would make the women's position much worse than it was because we had no criminalization. So there was a lot of discussions in the movement. What do we do? So I worked on the law change in New Zealand, first in New Zealand, then from Holland, because I became part, I'll talk about that later, of the International Lesbian and Gay Association. And we tried it in the 70s, we tried it in the late 70s, and we finally managed to decriminalize the male homosexuality in 1986. So that's already 14 years later, a long time later. And that only meant decriminalization. And the age of consent was 16, same as heterosexuals. So that was, and at the time, in 1986, I'm fast forwarding on this a little bit because it's interesting. There was a huge fight in New Zealand. New Zealand is a small conservative country with, at the time we had 3 million population, and this whole homosexuality question, law reform, really split the country down the middle, split families down the middle, caused lots of fuss. Salvation Army got in the game, and they collected something like 4 or 5 million signatures, which was more people than we had people in New Zealand. So we used to say, oh, the sheep have signed as well. You know, there's a lot of sheep in New Zealand. Anyway, it was a big fight, And it was only won in Parliament by 2 votes. I witnessed. There was a whole parliamentary committee, and I was witnessing from the International Gay Association, as were moral majority priests or moral majority, religious leaders from America. And this was 86, this was when AIDS had just broken through. So in my witnessing for this, one of the members of Parliament said to me, I see you with the ILGA, International Lesbian and Gay Association, as being responsible for being the biggest genocide program since the Second World War and the killing of the Jews. And he said that in an official hearing, and that was going to go into the... And I was so angry, I actually said that has to be out. I'll not continue this witnessing unless that goes out. Anyway, with only about 2 votes, it was won. But funnily enough, after all the fights that have been in New Zealand about this, once it had been decided, it sort of all quietened down. It was like a big decision had been taken. And then New Zealand continued to change the law in 93, I think. Discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation was not allowed anymore. 2004, you could not marry, but you could have civic union between 2 women and 2 men. And 2013, New Zealand accepted full marriage, including being able to adopt children. So if you look at that history, right from early 70s on to 2013, it's a long route, and all that time people were working on these issues, and all the time there were lesbian and gay movements and people working on it. But we did make progress, and that's the same in many countries in the world. When I started working with the International Lesbian and Gay Association in 70s, early 80s, I think there were only a handful of countries where homosexuality was legal. And now, if you look, I don't know if you want to look, if you look at for the ILGA, you can get a whole map of the world. I think there are now 70 countries out of the 200 countries in the world left that are criminalized, where that's a crime. There are about 50 countries where it's neither a crime nor it's protected, which Russia is as well. But that means there are up to 100 countries where there is some kind of legal base of acceptance for lesbian homosexuality. And I've seen people working in many countries on this during the years. I've seen them in Ireland making use of the European human rights courts, using legal ways. I've seen them in Peru. My present partner, Rebecca, comes from Peru. And that was interesting because when she was working on these issues, in Peru, the Catholic Church was very, very strong and important. And the real fight in Peru was about whether you're allowed to use condoms or not. And women wanted condoms used because they didn't want to have as many children. And Rebecca was on television in a debate with a Catholic priest about the use of condoms, which was partly about AIDS and which was partly about contraception and which was partly about the Catholic Church not telling us what to do when we want to know what we do with our own bodies. But it wasn't even particularly about lesbianism or homosexuality. It was about... So each strategy in each country can have different reasons or different allies. Because I remember when I was in Peru, I was amazed, because often the lesbian and gay movement was a little bit well-educated, elitist, but in Peru it wasn't. If we walked around the markets, you know, the vegetable markets or the fish markets, and Rebecca had been seen on television, people would go, "Yay, condoms!" You know, that was that was the issue, which was funny for me, because it was quite a different way into the discussion. Anyway, where am I? I'm back. I'll jump back. But anyway, the story I wanted to tell you with the ILGA, the international. At first, it was called the IGA, the International Gay Association, and we as women said it should be called ILGA, International Lesbian and Gay Association. Had big fights about that, and then they said no, lesbians can be a subcategory of the word gay, and then finally I suggested, let's make it ILA, International Lesbian Association. How come? I said, well, gay can be a subcategory of the word lesbian, but they didn't like that, so the solution was ILGA. Anyway, when I was first getting involved in all this, I thought the ILGA was a very well-established organization like Amnesty, or very well-organized. And at that time, in 1979, the Olympic Games were happening in Moscow in 1980, and ILGA had decided to hold a demonstration in Moscow during the Olympic Games against the law 121, I think it was, clause 121, and there were a couple of gay guys in prison, and so we were all preparing for an action, and they all decided it was really important that there was a woman there as well. So the preparations were 20 guys and me, said the crazy girl, and getting ready to go to Moscow. We got tickets for the Olympic Games, and we had action instructions like take big white towels and black markers so you can write messages, and we had to find journalists ourselves, and it was scary as hell. It was really scary. And I thought, as the only girl there, what's going to happen to me in that whole situation? And it was interesting because I had a paid job at the time, which was a temporary job, and I thought I better get that job made into a definite job, because if I do this action, I might be in trouble when it happens, you know. So, and Kathy, the same Kathy I was talking about before, she was one of the only people, because it was highly secret, of course, that I told this to, that I was going to go to Russia and demonstrate, and we were going to chain ourselves to the gates and door and get attention for the rights of homosexuals in Russia. I think I knew very little about Russia. I think I knew very little about the ILGA, which I thought was very well organized, and it wasn't. Kathy was totally against it. And Kathy, she had a funny argument. She said, "You don't even dare to ride on the tram without buying a ticket. How do you think you're going to do this kind of activism?" And it's true, at the time I didn't dare to ride on a tram without buying a ticket. So anyway, as it came closer and closer, the different gay organizations withdrew their candidates. So first there were 20 guys in Sylvia, then there were 15 guys in Sylvia, then there were 9 guys in Sylvia, then there were 7 guys in Sylvia, and then there were 3 guys in Sylvia. And at this point, the board of the COC, the Dutch Lesbian and Gay Association, it turned out there was nothing organized, there was no publicity organized, there was no contact with journalists. We just had to go there and write our message on a towel and chain ourselves up and then get deported. So in the end, the board decided that was not safe enough, and they wouldn't let me go. And to be honest, I was very relieved. Now, there was one guy who went, Enzo, from Italy, and he did it by himself and got big publicity all around the world, and was dragged away, was beaten up, was put on the next plane and went back to Italy. And when we saw him again at the next conference, he was so angry with everybody who had pulled out. I don't think he was that angry with me, because he understood that it was a big risk for a woman to do that. But to be honest, it was also an example for me of I got pulled into this idea, but I wasn't prepared. Nobody was prepared in the COC, nobody was prepared in the ILGA. We hadn't thought it through properly. We hadn't looked at the consequences. You know more about Russia than I do. So it was very naive, to be honest. And I think I count myself quite lucky that I didn't have to sit through that. It did affect my life, though, because it made me realize that I could actually demand for things. So I demanded my job to become a steady job, and there were all kinds of things I did because I kept thinking I might not be around in 6 months' time. So it sort of gave me an assertiveness. Is that the word? Assertiveness that I hadn't had before. All right. So then, by this time, I'm working in Holland in a normal paid job, but I'm also doing a lot of work with COC and Ricky, who's here with me. We worked so hard in the 80s partly on increasing the women's position in the lesbian and gay organizations, because COC was a very male-dominated organization. I'll give you an example. there were no places to go out in Amsterdam back then. You won't believe it. So we had a COC bar and dance place and things like that. And that was, all the guys went there on Friday night and on Saturday night. And for women, there was absolutely nowhere to go. So we said the Saturday night should be for women. The guys can go elsewhere. On Friday night can be for men, Saturday night can be for women. Well, that caused all kinds of fights, and then they said, yeah, but there's not enough women and we won't make enough money on the bar, because we were making money on the alcohol sales too. And so then we had to try and get more women in. So one of the things Ricky and I did back then is we organized lesbian debates. And so on Saturday night, exactly at 9 o'clock, we had a debate, old English debating style, 2 teams of 3 arguing on some particular statement. And we voted in the audience beforehand, and people gave their arguments, and then we voted which team had done better and which, whether people had changed their minds, and then everyone stayed and danced and enjoyed themselves. And it was a good way of getting the crowd in. I used to think up the topics, and Ricky used to organize, did the really hard work. And we had, for a debate, people who know that, you have to have a very sharp topic. You have to, like, it's got to be, can't be nuanced, because that's the fun of debates like that. So we'd have topics like, all lesbians are alcoholists. That was one of them, I think. Or you could be for or against. Well, we had lots. Lesbians are too scared to enjoy sexuality. I think that was another one that people would get really angry about. So we had a good time. And we did have real ideological differences of opinion with the guys, because most of the male homosexuals back then, in the 80s, were not thinking gender, they were thinking equal rights. So we want equal rights as heterosexuals. And most women were thinking, but the whole gender construct is wrong, and we want to have structural changes in the position of women and men anyway. So we were much more on a feminist agenda, if you like. And that also, because gay men were not that used to dealing with women. They didn't even have to deal with women in their relationships, as straight guys do have to, you know. So there was quite a lot of tensions within the COC. And so we set up, Ricky and I set up all kinds of constructions. If there was a fight somewhere, and we had 45 COCs in Holland, different places in Holland, if there was a fight between the men and the guys and the girls, then they could call us at the head office of COC, and then we called ourselves the lijmpot. Now what's that? What do you call that? That you have to fix something. When something breaks, you have to glue it. The glue. We were the glue pot. We would come with the glue pot and try and fix up the fight. And it was fun because they knew our position was going to be pro-women, so they often would say, no, please don't send the glue pot. No, don't let them come. We'll fix it ourselves. We'll sort it out. And we did a lot of international work. We started something called Interpot, which was Interpol, trying to find out where lesbians were in other countries. And it's hard to imagine now. We were writing blue aerograms, you know, those blue aerograms that you had back then. And we were writing messages to feminist organizations that we found out, excuse me, would it be possible that there are some lesbians in your feminist organization? And if so, could we be in contact with them? And so slowly we were building up a network of contacts around the world, thinking we need to support each other, which was very true, because many were very isolated and very discriminated in many places. So I think our big breakthrough was when we were preparing for the United Nations Women's Conference. United Nations used to have women conferences in 75 and 80, 85, 95, and since then it's stopped, unfortunately, though each year there's still a big happening at the United Nations about the Commission on the Status of Women, where each country has to say how the position of women are in their countries. So in 85 we prepared for this, and we managed to get some money from the Dutch government, and we managed to organize ourselves And we asked the State Secretary, the Dutch State Secretary, to talk about lesbianism at the United Nations. That's the first time homosexuality was mentioned at the United Nations in the official things. And we worked the ground, as you might say, at the forum and it was funny because we had made a lot of material called Women Loving Women, and we knew in Nairobi that homosexuality was illegal, and we didn't know how to get the material to the conference because we knew if we sent it by mail it probably wouldn't arrive. And this is also very funny when you think about it now. We made packages, 2-kilo packages of lesbian material, and we went to the Schiphol airport, and we just walked up to any woman who looked kind of feminist and said, "Excuse me, are you going to Nairobi to the women's conference?" "Yes." "Would you like to take 2 kilo of lesbian material with you?" And many did, you know. It was a fantastic action. And they said, "What do we do when we get there?" "Oh, just put it at the reception, we'll find it." It was wonderful. It was really good. Anyway, when we arrived there, the day before the conference started, I went to get a table, a bit like this. I went to the library and got a table to put our material on the lawn. And immediately some guards came with guns, and organizers came and said, "You're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to have this material here, you're not allowed to have a table on the lawn, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that." And I argued and finally took the table back to the library, and then we just put the material on the ground, of course. Anyway, but this incident, which took quite a while, was actually followed by quite a lot of journalists who were waiting for everything to start. And so the next day in the newspapers in Nairobi, it said that lesbians had come to town, and that the main lesbian, Sylvia Borren, had been arrested and was in jail, which wasn't true. I was sitting on the lawn with my material, but it caused a lot of publicity, and it caused a lot of publicity in Holland, and it caused a lot of publicity in Nairobi, and it caused a lot of publicity in Africa. And from that moment on, you've got to imagine, for 2 weeks, we'd arrive at, Ricky was there again, we'd arrive at 9 in the morning, and there'd be 200, 300, 500 men, all wanting to come and look at the lesbians. And it was really weird for us, because we wanted to talk to the women, of course. But they were very fascinated, and they kept saying, homosexuality doesn't exist in Africa. And I would say, "Oh, that's funny, I've heard about your boarding schools." And then everyone would laugh, and I've heard from women this, and they kept, so we really had to work hard to not talk to the men. And they said, "Why aren't you talking to us? Why don't you show us how you do it? And who's the boss in your relationship? And how can you have sex without a penis?" And I would say, "If you don't know the answer to that question, your wife is not a happy woman." You know, and so there were so many of these answers we had to give all the time. And as time went on, the men sort of disappeared a bit, and the women would come. And so we had a lot of fun. And we did manage to get an international lineup of lesbians from most continents and countries of the world, and we had a lot of publicity, and we were constantly being told that there were dangerous things going to happen to us. I think during those 2 weeks I was supposed to have been arrested about 7 times, but I wasn't. And they kept saying that I remember one night we were going to have a big party, and they said if we go there, everybody will be in jail. But I had the idea then, again maybe naive, but I thought there's so much publicity and attention on this conference, this UN conference, that now we are as safe as we can ever be. It's when the cameras are away that you've got to be careful. Then things can go nasty. But while we were there, we felt pretty safe, and we were safe. And a lot of the women we met in Nairobi later became part of our lesbian network. We had an international lesbian information service, and we had, in '87, we had the first conference in Mexico for whole Latin America, and so we made a lot of progress, if you like. Also talking about that lesbianism should be legal and should not be discriminated against and should be allowed, and so it was all good activist work, actually. We ourselves in Holland weren't totally, you think Holland is such a good country, but before this 85 and 82, I think 82 it was, 82, our own Pink Saturday was beaten up in one of the cities in Holland. A lot of young football hooligan types came and beat us up. And it was and a lot of the gay guys didn't accept that, so there was huge fights. And then the police came and separated us, and the police basically took us in small groups back to the station and out of town. And the most horrible thing is that there were a lot of adults there during these fights encouraging the boys. So it was really an anti-gay violence that was being shown, which started us on saying, well, we are citizens of Holland like any other citizens, and we need to be protected against violence of other citizens. So the government has a job to protect us. So we started talking to the national government and the local governments and the provincial governments and the police and everybody, and said, we are citizens. We have civil rights. We have the right to be protected like anybody. And that started a whole process in Holland of policies on lesbians and gays. So now there's something called lesbian and gay policies, and we went right through all the laws we could find on what should be equality between straight and lesbian gay. So we did a lot of policy work. We had good political people, and we changed a lot of laws in Holland, right up to lesbian women being allowed artificial insemination if they wanted children anonymously, right up to now, if two lesbian women have children, the second woman can adopt the children. So there are a lot of laws were changed through the years. None of it went quickly, but all of it we worked on. From that one demonstration, we went for our rights, our full rights as citizens, and that was a very useful line to follow up, and it's still being followed up, I think, in many countries. Let me think. I have to think. I'm being too slow, aren't I? Is it all right? Are you all right? Is it interesting? Yeah? Let me think. I better check where I am in my story. Oh, yes, you can. I'm not even looking at that. Oops. Okay. I've done Nairobi. Well, what happened to me is that first I was working in education, and then I became a consultant with a very nice consultancy in Holland, which worked with civil society organizations and with local government and national government. So I became my activism, which up till then had been done as a volunteer. So I had a job that paid my rent, and I had my volunteer jobs. And I used to think, I sometimes think, how did I do that? I was 30, but I was working full-time at my job, and then I was working full-time at the COC as well. I think I just worked double shifts in those days. I must have been fit. And I still had the idea, I must tell that too, I still had the idea that I wasn't going to have children because I thought society can make me vulnerable through my children, so I didn't dare to do that. And then a then girlfriend of mine in Holland said, but that's not true in Holland. If you want children, you can have children. So then I thought, oh, that's probably, Holland is better, that's probably true. Anyway, I never did end up having children. I was too busy with all my activism. Oh yes, and I should say one more thing. At the time, we're talking 80s, right? I don't know if that's true here. I don't think so by the look of you. But at the time, there was a very strong radical lesbianism, and they didn't want to work with men, didn't want to know about men, didn't want to be seen talking to men. And if you're a real lesbian, you had short cut hair and you were not going to have anything to do with men. Now, my situation was a bit more complicated than that because as a matter of sexual reality, I am actually bisexual. So I was having a relationship with a girlfriend and with a boyfriend at the same time for a long time. And I first kept my boyfriend secret because I thought it wasn't very good for my activism, which is a bit silly, isn't it? I know. My boyfriend Hank used to say to me, I come home after some lesbian conference I'd been to, and then he'd say, "I suppose you denied my existence again." I say, "I certainly did. Don't want to know about you." Anyway, and then somebody said to me in the COC, in the lesbian and gay movement, "This is silly, Sylvia. Bisexuals also." Bisexuality then was seen as gays, gay men usually, or lesbian women who were too scared to come out. And the funny thing was, since the moment that I was disinherited by my parents, I was always out as a lesbian, because that was the problematic side of the story. So every work I was in, every situation I was in, every speech I held, I always talked about my sexual preference, at least the lesbian side of my sexual preference. And I didn't talk about the other side, because that was making life complicated and I was confusing people. And yes, it was at the same time, which also meant, yes, of course, my girlfriend knew about it, my boyfriend knew about it. At the height of my sexual activity, a long time ago, I think I had 3 girlfriends and 1 boyfriend. The boyfriend I had for 23 years, until he finally decided to go with another girlfriend full-time. My girlfriend, Rebecca, now, she says to me, "Yeah, well, you taught me about having multiple relationships." She now has another partner as well as me. But my rule was always open. I have it open. So you have to be able to manage your time, manage jealousy, manage enjoying yourself apart from each other. And I used to say, if everybody did it my way, life would be much happier and we could have more sex, which is true. But I've also learned that not many people can do it. I've found that a lot of people can't do it, which is a pity, I think. So I can really encourage you, go for it. But manage your time, manage your jealousy. Anyway, well, I felt, and that was the same with cutting my hair off and all that kind of thing, I felt I haven't stepped out of one lot of rules, heterosexual rules, in order to step into another lot of lesbian rules, you know. And so by the time I finally was open about it, actually, the only one, it didn't really matter. People trusted my work, saw that I was working very hard on the issues, and that was more important than what I happened to do in bed with whom or whatever. But I think I think it's much easier in Holland now. I think, isn't it, Ricky? Now people can dress the way they want to, have their hair the way they want to, have SM if they're lesbians too, or have whatever they feel like. It's a more freer time now. And I think that's probably true in all lesbian and gay movements. My experience is when it's early time in the lesbian gay movement, people want to have roles. I mean, people were forever asking Kathy and me and Rebecca and me, because she's from Peru where they still have roles at times, so who's butch and who's femme? And we'd say, we don't know. What do you think? Because we didn't work like that, you know. But in some countries that's still quite important, and that still happens. Anyway, where are we? So I'm working as a consultant and getting paid, and I was working with a lot of broader civil society. I was working on children's rights, migrant rights, also lesbian and gay, feminist organizations. Climate began to come in already then in the late 80s. So I was beginning to realize that my fight for rights of lesbians and gays and my fight for the rights of women are 2 topics amongst a whole lot of other topics. And there are more issues to be looked at. And as you begin to understand how power relationships play out, how minorities and majorities play out, you begin to understand there's patterns there which actually affect a lot of people. So I suppose I became an activist in a more general sense of the word. Because I'd been working internationally with lesbians and then with feminists, and I was also working a lot in development work. So one of the big organizations in Holland is NOVIP, now called Oxfam NOVIP, and I used to work with their partners. And then at some point, they said, would you come and become director of Oxfam NOVIP? So I became, which was working against poverty. So for 13 years, I was director of Oxfam NOVIP in Holland. It's a big organization. We got a lot of money from Dutch government and from Dutch public, and we were supporting 800 organizations in about 60 countries. Should I do something here? Oh, it's there. Yep. That taught me that poverty is that makes life, that's an all different ballgame. When you're talking about sexual rights and sexuality and women having choices about their bodies, when you're talking about poverty, you're not talking about any of that. I don't know any woman in the world who doesn't prostitute herself if she wants to get food for her children. I just do not know. And that means that sexual preference is nearly a luxury item for many women in those situations. And that meant that I suddenly realized that economic situations have a tremendous effect on human rights. And if you don't have the economic possibilities, then particularly for women, your choices are much more limited. And so I became and have stayed anti-poverty activist and will be so all my life. And particularly, it's particularly women and their dependents. I always say women and their dependents, which is their children, it's the elder people, it's the sick people in the family. And I'm making a slight jump forward because I worked with Oxfam Nova for 13 years, and then I thought I've got this as big and as good as I can get it. And then I was 56 by this time, and I thought I'll go and do something else. And I worked with the big network called the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. We only had about 6 employees, but in the height of our organizing in 2009, we had 1 weekend of organizing against poverty. We had 172 million people who were counted and photographed and standing up against poverty. And in many countries, they managed to get more money for education, for health, for social benefits, for minimum wage, for child benefits, all kinds of things. So that was very exciting to be able to see that. And of those 172 million people, only 2 million came from Europe. 170 million came from Africa, Asia, Latin America, etc. Because that's where people live in poverty, and that's where people fight for poverty, against poverty. And in India, we got a lot more money for education, and it was a fantastic movement. Anyway, so I'm happily doing that kind of work and doing some consultancy again. And then there's a guy called Kumi Naido. He's from South Africa. He worked against apartheid when he was 15, and then he did all kinds of things. But anyway, he was at that point the director of Greenpeace International, and he said, "Come on, Sylvia, you've got to come and run Greenpeace Netherlands." And I said, "Don't be silly. Greenpeace is a young people's movement. I'm turning 60 this year. You can't ask a 60-year-old to run Greenpeace, So I said no. And they went and tried to find somebody again. So he came back to me 3 months later and said, "Sylvia, we've looked for somebody and we all agree you've got to come and run Greenpeace. It doesn't matter that you're 60. When has age ever worried you?" So anyway, he talked me into it. And to be honest, I had a great time for 6 years running Greenpeace Netherlands, because if you follow my story from lesbian and gay and my private activism for my own sexuality, going into feminism, going into anti-poverty, I then began to realize that the climate change is the biggest threat that we're facing in this planet. And it's actually the biggest gender question. Not many people recognize this, but it's the Western world and our fossil fuel addiction and our terrible lifestyles. It's actually causing climate change, but the price is being paid in African and Asian countries where there's flooding, there's droughts, and those same women with their dependents, their children and their sick relatives and their elderly, are the ones that cannot get food together. And they're the ones that are dying. I mean, we're not dying in Holland. We're complaining about it getting warmer in the summer. It's a luxury positioning on climate change. But there are other people in the world who are living low CO2 lives who are actually paying the price for what we are doing. So to me, as I began to work with Greenpeace and realizing how important this is, Shell became, and I've been asked to tell the Shell story, and I'm so sorry, but one of the things is when you work for Greenpeace, it's quite funny really, one of the things is that you've got to do actions and show activism. Now, I'd shown activism all my life in different ways, but not quite in a Greenpeace way. So I knew that it was really important for me as Greenpeace director to be part of some action and to get arrested. And that was very important. At the time when this was happening, one of my brothers from New Zealand was staying at my place, and it was funny because I said, well, I'm going away for a few days and I can't tell you what I'm doing. And he said, you've got to tell me what you're doing, you've got to tell me what you're doing. I said, I can't tell you what I'm doing and I'm not sure when I'll be back. That was true. And for me, Shell is my biggest enemy because Shell, it's a Dutch company initially, now Dutch English. Shell actually knew about climate change way back in the 70s and 80s. They had the research, they knew it was CO2 emissions causing it, they knew what was happening, they had the research, they had the strategies even then, and they decided they couldn't make as much profit. And I even in 2004, Shell was actually working on solar light panels, and they decided that wasn't going to make them enough profit, and so they stopped their solar program. And at the time, I was working with Oxfam Novib, and I wanted to work with them because I wanted to get lampposts in all African villages and slums to make it safer for women at night. You can have lampposts with solar light, which just goes out halfway through the night and then lights up again the next day, and so you have light early evening through the night. And I had a big project going with Shell, and then they decided they stopped the whole solar program because it wasn't making them enough profit margins. Fossil fuel was. So I've hated Shell considerably for a considerably long time. So anyway, my wonderful Greenpeace activist colleagues decided that we were going to zap Shell. We zapped Shell quite regularly, but this was one time when we were doing it too. And what we did was, and I can't tell you all the details because some of these things are secrets, but what we did was I went with some colleagues early in the morning and walked into the Shell headquarters in The Hague, and I won't tell you how we walked in and how we got in, and walked right up to the boardroom of the Shell director, and this was about 6:30 in the morning, so there was nobody there, and we locked ourselves into that boardroom. And then I had 70 colleagues, volunteers from Greenpeace, who shut off all the doors and entry points of the big Shell building all around, locked themselves in as Greenpeace does, with chains and with locks and things like that. And then we also had Greenpeace has a wonderful polar bear, which has white polar bear, obviously, which has you have to have two people walking in it, so it walks quite slowly and it looks like a real bear, and it always scares people. And then we had climbers, Greenpeace climbers, who climbed up to the wall of Shell and changed the Shell emblem into half Shell, half polar bear, which was our action sign. So it was a very coordinated action. And my role was that in the boardroom, I was being filmed as saying, I am now the new executive director of Shell International, and we've decided to stop fossil fuel because we all know it's very bad for us. We're working with Greenpeace. We're going to go green, and we're going to go solar and wind, and you'll be hearing from us. And we had organized a television bus outside the building who actually streamed that particular speech of mine. So that was actually sent out on television. It was a spoof, obviously. But I'll tell you what, for years later, people would come up to me in the street and say, how are you enjoying your job at Shell? Which is really funny. I have to say, well, it was temporary. It was very temporary. Anyway, so when we did all this, the police came and my colleagues the chains were cut and they were sent home. None of them were arrested. And first they didn't believe we were in there. So Shell, and I kept saying, I need to speak to the old CEO of Shell, because I'm the new CEO of Shell, and we have to, we have to exchange information about my new job. But he wouldn't come, of course. And then the police didn't believe we're in there, and so the press people outside said you have to come to the window and show that you're there, and my spoof speech was being sent out on television. So it was all very exciting. And then the police did believe we were in there, so they came knocking. They had come knocking on the door a few times before, but we just kept quiet. So they thought it was an empty, locked room. And so then they came again. You got to open the door and you got to let us in. And so there's always a rule within Greenpeace that when you're in an action, the people in the center of the action have to decide what to do, because if you don't obey, Greenpeace is always strictly non-violent, but if you don't obey the police orders, you can get into more trouble. So the three guys and I said, "What do we do?" And we said, "No, let's stay here. We're not going to open the door." So we waited and waited and waited, and then I think for me one of the funniest moments was we heard some noise outside the door, and then suddenly they came with a chainsaw, and it was a big, heavy oak door, and suddenly there was this, and they just cut the door in half. And the colleague who'd taken the film of my speech still had his camera, so he actually filmed that, and that went out on YouTube too. It can probably still be found somewhere, that they cut through the door. Anyway, so we duly got arrested, and unfortunately for me, they didn't want to show us to the public, so they took us out through the garage, very clandestine way, and put us in a cell. And I was put in a police cell with a very nice naked pin-up girl in the cell. So when the police later came and got me, I thanked them for paying attention to the sexual preference of their prisoners. And the policeman got really annoyed with me. I'd had hours of thinking up that joke, of course, but he was very annoyed. Anyway, and so that was all big publicity, and I did have to go to court over that. I did, and they made me come into court myself, and I was convicted. I was fined 260 euros. I have a conviction to my name and 260 euros. And it was funny. I was talking to some civil servants of a local government, I think, and I was telling this story. And these civil servants said to me, "But that means you can never work for government again." And I said, "Well, actually, I don't think I will be working for government again anyway. Not at my stage, not in my time in life. I don't mind not working for government anyway." But that was really good action, and it meant that within Greenpeace, I've done more actions after that towards Shell and towards others, but that was the most spectacular one. And it was nice because doing this spoof, like I am the new CEO of Shell, was such a nice way of doing it too. And we had a lot of positive reactions in Holland over that. Sometimes Greenpeace gets negative reactions because we're being difficult, but on this one, people enjoyed it quite a lot, so that was good. So let me think. Where am I? Let me check where I am in my story. I'm missing a few bits and pieces, but never mind. I think after my time with Greenpeace, I'm now actually still working. I'm working, some of you know them, I think, with Governance and Integrity, who work with, there's a bureau in Lviv working on integrity of government here. And I'm still working with BRUC, which is the biggest development organization in the world, a Bangladeshi organization, who particularly work in Bangladesh, but also in other African and Asian countries. So I'm still involved in, and I occasionally still speak for lesbian and gay issues or feminist issues like here. So if I can be helpful in any way, I am. I'm feeling that my whole wave of activism, which you can see went from lesbianism to feminism to poverty to climate, and for me there's all logical steps, but I'm feeling that I rode a wave of, if you like, emancipation, where we thought it'll come right. We might take one step forward and one step back, but in the longer run we'll get our rights. And if you look at the lesbian and gay advances we've made worldwide, there's a lot of reason to say that, to be very proud of, you know, what's been achieved at UN and what's been achieved in the trade unions for lesbian and gays, what's been achieved, etc. Feminism, I'm a little bit less satisfied with. I think the gender roles are tough as hell, and they keep coming back in different forms and different things. But I'm now very worried about climate, and I believe, having, of course, had to study it a lot when I was with Greenpeace, I believe we have 12 years left to control the warming of the Earth, to not go beyond the 2 degrees. And 12 years is a hell of a short time. That's like one more period with Trump and we are done for, you know, and I'm serious about that. So that's my big worry. And because I see climate change as being a moral issue on gender, and the people who pay the price for climate change are women, and particularly women living in poverty, and particularly women who are not part of causing the problem, but who are paying with their lives for the problem, I get very, very radical on position of, I always get upset that people don't understand that climate change is a gender issue. But hardly everyone writes about that or speaks about that. I held a big speech last November in England about it. So climate change is really important. But the other thing is, we have seen a world where the gap between rich and poor has become bigger and bigger, and we've got the oligarchic, and you know more about this than I do, the oligarchic forces who are winning, who are actually stealing the public money from the governments that they run, who are actually dismantling democratic institutions like courts and all those kind of things in America, and who are using xenophobic dialogue, xenophobic messaging to divide and rule the people, and to set people up against each other, and to strengthen their own illegal and oligarchic position in that, which is very true in this country. You had a fantastic Maidan revolution, which many of us from beyond Ukraine admired so much. But what has happened since, and what's going to happen on Sunday? So now my position is that all these different movements, the civil movements, playing nice actions in Greenpeace is not good enough anymore. Working on lesbian and gay rights by itself is not good enough anymore. Working on climate change by itself is not good enough anymore. We've somehow got to get the civil disobedience, and I don't think we're in a stage anymore where we are making progress. I think we're in a stage where we have to resist the fact that it's turning the other way now. Now there's a guy called, I don't know if you've heard of him, Stefan Hessel. He was a French man who survived the Second World War, and in 2012 he wrote a little pamphlet called Be Indignant, or Be Outraged is another translation of his little booklet. And he apparently in this said every young person and every person in the world should work out what they are outraged at. Now when I look at my own life, I was outraged that I wasn't allowed to be in love with my girlfriend to start with, and later I became outraged at other things. So he's died now. He died in 2014, but his little pamphlet is supposed to have sparked the Arab Spring demonstrations. I don't know. It won't have been the only thing, but it was played some role in that. And I've been teaching some students in Amsterdam more recently, where we've looked at what are you outraged at, young people today. What are you feeling that you can commit to? What are you feeling that you've got to fight for? What do you have to say, I resist, and come no further? And we're seeing a lot of the sneaking anti-Semitism, and I'm not talking about what Israel is doing. Don't start me on that, because I worked on the peace movement in Israel and Palestine, so I'm not talking about Israel. But I am talking about anti-Semitism. I'm talking about the anti-Roma. I'm talking about Europe being disgusting about the migrants and the refugees trying to come through Greece into Europe and hardly taking any people. I'm talking about Hungary and how they've positioned themselves. And I'm talking about, there's lots of things to talk about. And that's Europe. And I'm talking about the stupid Brexit. And Europe is, in terms of rules about climate, rules about products, rules about labor laws, rules about gender, Europe is still one of the best places in the world, but we're beginning to lose in Europe as well. And we'll have our European elections soon, and the populist voices are anti-Europe, are going nationalist, are going xenophobic, are going, well, all the things you know about. So somehow, why I'm 68 and still standing here and still busy with all this, is that I look after a little 2.5-year-old once a week, and I look at him and I think, I've worked hard as an activist all my life, and look at the world I'm letting you inherit. It's not good enough. It's just not good enough. We've got to do better than that. And that goes for my age and any age, and that it doesn't matter what age you are. But we've got to somehow connect the dots between the different movements, because one movement by itself can make progress, and I have made a lot of progress, and a lot of things I'm proud of in my life, but one movement by itself can't fight what's happening now, where the opposition, our anti-human rights forces are connecting the dots, and they're winning. Not just here, but elsewhere as well. And I would love to get the inspiration of Maidan back into the streets. Today in London there's demonstrations where they're blocking the city. Now it's interesting because they're called, what are they called? They call themselves existence rebels or something. They're climate activists, and they're blocking the traffic in London. I don't understand why the 6 million people who put signatures to prevent Brexit haven't shut down the city already for 6 months, like you did with Maidan. Why? Then we would have been having a different story about Brexit. So I suspect that you have a history of resisting here, which is very inspiring for many of us who have lived the more privileged activism, if you like. So that's what I'd like to talk about. But I also understand that there is still work to be done on issues of sexual freedom and all those kind of things. And so if you look at the topics, we're talking about political freedom and the amnesties and the human rights organizations that work on that. We're talking about economic freedom, which is the anti-poverty movements that I've been part of. And unless you get the economics right, no woman has freedom over her own body unless she knows what she has to eat and what her children have to eat. And then finally we have the freedom to pursue our happiness in whichever sexuality, lifestyle, however many partners or not partners we want. And those three have to somehow be connected and not be controlled by other anti-democratic forces. So I don't know whether my story is any use to you at all, actually, but let's have some discussion now. Thank you.
Дякуємо. Я вже знаю, як ми почнемо пост-реліз з цієї події. Якби британці зібрались на Майдан, не було б ніякого Брекситу. Фраза. Зміна точки зору. Дякуємо Сильвії, і ми готові побігати з мікрофоном по ваші питання, відповіді, коментарі, заклики до революції, освідчення в коханні, оголошення про купівлю-продаж оренду. Працюємо за правилом піднятої руки. У кого є питання, я не сумнівався. Віталій.
Thank you. I will ask a question in English. I would like to go back to your stories and your experience of activism in LGBTQ community. And it's very interesting to me because you have described your experience of trying to come out before your family in 1972. And this story is so similar and so familiar to so many of us here in Ukraine, still in 2019. And you have talked about arguments between, for example, lesbians and gay people, and we have the same in Ukraine because we have arguments even within the organizing committee of the Kyiv Pride, and it's very disappointing because it's one of the main organizations. So maybe you have some piece of advice to us here in Ukraine, to all the activists who are trying to pursue our agenda, to the government officials, so they see us as the united community and not as a divided one.
Well, on the parents, on the parents bit, this is quite an interesting one for me. I have through the years, have experienced so many lesbian and gays who first themselves had to come out to themselves and struggle with that. And in fact, back in the 70s, many of the lesbian and gay organizations, even in Europe, were run by leaders who were not out to their family. I used to be really shocked about that, but they were not daring to be out to their family yet. So the first thing is, and I described it to you, that my bisexual self took a bit longer to accept, not for myself, but for how it would be perceived. So the first thing is to decide yourself, this is who I am, and fuck the rest of them. This is who I am, you know. That's the first bit. Then if you do tell parents, I know these stories happen still today, all the time, don't expect your parents to be thrilled straight away, because it is a shock. And give them time as well. So this is something that's often forgotten. By the time somebody has finally worked themselves up, and I did exactly the same, work myself up to tell my parents, I expected them to say, that's a good idea. Well, of course they didn't. My parents were pretty radical. They kicked me out. But they also came back after 2 or 3 years. And we I'd say reconciliation is a big word. They accepted they couldn't control me, and I accepted they couldn't control me, and so we got on with it, you know, and we ended up quite well. The issues between men and women in the lesbian and gay movement are more complicated. I think patterns of male-female gender roles, dominance, etc., subdominance happen in the gay movement too. And the actual, I always would like to encourage the guys to understand that feminism is about structurally trying to get rid of these stupid gender roles and that will allow more structural freedom for everyone. So not just go for equality, I want to be the same as heteros and get married and live happily ever after. That's a bit limited. But to actually find the political agenda you can agree on together. Now, any group that's a minority and discriminated against always ends up having infights. This is one of the saddest things, and it actually weakens the movements, and I've seen it time and time again. To be honest, the best way to deal with that is to find some men and women who are prepared to build bridges across the differences of opinion. So it's up to I was, for instance, a leader who worked with the radical lesbians. I worked with the lesbian and gays. I worked with the non-radical gay men. And we had the AIDS problem starting in my time, which was a totally different ballgame again for the men, certainly, in the early 80s when getting HIV/AIDS was a death sentence, and we went through all that. So you've got to have people who understand that there can be different positions, but that you can still combine on doing your gay pride, or combine on getting a particular political agenda passed. And so that takes a broader leadership, I think, vision. And I think it goes beyond the lesbian and gay movement. Your allies should be the feminists, although they're sometimes hopeless with lesbian. I mean, in my time, in 85, the feminists who were out there kept saying, we're not lesbian, by the way. I'm very happily married and I have 7 children, you know. And we used to say, thank you very much. That's really good solidarity that you're showing there. How about backing your lesbian sisters? We've backed your feminist agenda on abortion. How about you backing our lesbian freedom? And have those discussions, you know. So you need people who understand that the bigger picture is more important than a very specific political issue that you might be fighting for at one point. And the rainbow flag is actually a very nice symbol, I think, because if you make that into an umbrella, under that rainbow umbrella, there can be many specific issues. And the one can be working on this issue and the other can be working on that issue. The biggest fight we had in the beginning of the ILGA was that the guys were arguing that sexuality should be free much younger, with younger boys. And a lot of my male gay friends had very good experiences when they were 12 or 13 or 14, because they had a lot of power over the older guys and they could decide what they wanted from them and things like that. But the women had a lot of bad experiences with sexuality at an early age, be it incest, be it rape, be it other kinds of sexual violence. So you imagine that those two movements had to agree on things together. And if the guys that could not understand that when you're having sex, talking about sex with children, there's power differentials involved. And of course now we know the Catholic Church, and now we know that a lot of boys were abused in a lot of boarding schools and God knows what. So now we're much further down the track on sexual violence. We know a lot more than we did back then. But you can imagine the arguments we used to have between men and women on that. But it takes, if you want to solve that, become a leader that builds bridges and find some other women, others, trans, whatever, who are prepared to also build bridges, and make yourself a leadership team that is prepared to jump over the small problems. Allow people to work on those issues, but get your act together to have a good pride, and not with what was it, 6,000 policemen? Mm-hmm. I don't know. Was it necessary to have that many policemen there?
Yes, for repeat.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we should all move quite a lot of gay activists from the rest of Europe into Kiev when you have your next Pride.
You're kindly invited.
Well, I will. I'll come. And some of my political friends from the European Parliament were there actually in the past too. Ulrika, yes, she was there, and there was one of the Green parties, Ulrika Lunacek. I think she came as well. And so I do know people who did that. That's right. Because we have to show that solidarity towards each other. Okay.
Далі. Руки. Я не бачу ваші руки. Тоді є одразу аж дві.
I said in English. So, thank you for this inspiring lecture. And I have a question for you. In whom or in what you search your motivation to make this activity?
Ask it again, sorry.
In whom or in what you search your activity?
I judge my activity.
Search. Search, motivation.
Oh, my motivation. Yeah, okay. There, in my life, I've always had other activists as examples who are older than me or more out there than me. Or there's a wonderful politician in Holland called Hedy Dancona. She was both a politician and a civil activist, and she worked in the European Parliament for a long time. And she always kept working on feminism and on she worked for abortion laws, and she's 83 now. I still work with her, and she's now working for the right to finish your own life when you feel like it, so forms of more euthanasia and things like that. She's an inspiration because she'll never stop either. Kumi Naidoo, who I mentioned, the South African activist, he was the head of Greenpeace when he pulled me into Greenpeace, but he's now the head of Amnesty International. He's also an example of someone who I admire a lot. And of course, someone like Stefan Hessel, I haven't met the guy, but I read his life story, his biography, and his pamphlet. I think there are people in history. We always say Gandhi and there's people in history, but I actually think for me it's often closer to home. It's often Ricky Bartels, who's sitting here, who's stubborn as hell when she wants to do something activist. Like when we were trying to get the Dutch State Secretary of Emancipation to speak at the UN, she just walked into the meeting and said she was from the press and asked a question saying, "Are you going to mention this at the UN?" And the woman answered, the minister answered yes, and it was in all the newspapers, so then she couldn't say no anymore. But it takes a kind of cheekiness or guts, or it is a form of activism too. And I suppose what I started my story with, from that first moment when I had to choose do I bow to my parents' wishes or not? I really feel that choice comes again and again and again. And I'm telling you that I'm quite glad I didn't have to go to Moscow at the Olympic Games in 1980, because that was scary as hell. But maybe I should have gone, and maybe somebody else has gone since. Somebody else did it. So, yeah, you get your motivation from the fact that you want to get things done. You want to get things changed. You don't want to. I suppose that's the way it is. I look at this 2.5-year-old I see every week now, and I think, what if he's going to ask me later on, what did you do? What did you do when you were growing up? At least I can say something. What are you going to do? I mean, all of you have done things. All of you are here because you've already taken brave choices, I think. Yeah?
Well, thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. It was really fascinating to listen to your life story, and but there was one thing that I'm particularly interested in, and this is, I was also very active in an international peace organization and so on and so forth, and what I always recognized is that on the one hand, of course there are so many organizations out there, and they're all very, very important, but as you said, they exist for themselves. They try to reach as much as possible within their reach, but they do not connect. But on the other hand, there are people like you who are in this one organization, then 10 years later they're in another organization, and so there is a personal link that is not used somehow. And I was wondering, what is your explanation for that? And how could we overcome this weakness, it seems?
Oh, that's a hard question. It's a good question. I think partly, certainly for me, when I was very busy, for instance, when Ricky and I in the 80s were very busy in the COC, our whole life was the COC. So we weren't connected to the migrant movement or to other movements because we were so busy with COC. And so that was our universe at that time, and that was mostly run by volunteers, so we had the group organizing the magazine, and we had the group organizing the bars, and we had the group sewing SM costumes for the leather guys, and we had the young ones performing we had something called the Pink Rimple, which was the oldies. I would now be a very good member of the Pink Rimple. And so we had all these activities, but we were the center of our own universe. So we sort of didn't have time or interest in anything else beyond that. And it wasn't until I began to work with other parts of civil society that I learned how many good causes there are out there. And sometimes civil society, like business, gets into competition with each other for funding, for press noise, who gets the voice, who gets to speak out. Which person is allowed to stand on the platform and hold the major speech. You can get all kinds of fuss about that kind of things. So there's no reason to think in civil society that we're nicer people than the rest of the world, actually, unfortunately. We sometimes think we're better. I'm working a lot with governance and integrity now on sexual harassment within civil society. And there's a lot of sexual harassment within civil society. And everybody says, no, we're value-driven and we have the right ideas. And there's still plenty of men who can't keep their hands at home when it's about men and women, So they've got to work out on their policies on preventing sexual harassment within the amnesties of this world, or within the Médecins Sans Frontières, or within all those different ones. So we're not better than the rest of the guys and girls out there. I do think if I was to have my time again, I would work even stronger than I did then at making interconnections. Because I think we're winning little battles, but we're losing the big picture. That's my big concern at the moment. We're losing against the Trumps of this world and the whoever. I won't decide who wins on Sunday. We need each other.
Thank you. Talking about bigger picture, I'm watching Our Planet on Netflix now, and the number stuck in my mind. 12 years you mentioned,
yes.
And like we totally understand that the shell is evil, right? But what is the division of power in this field? Other like good companies you look after, and what should be done in 12 years to avoid this huge disaster? Because like it's,
I know
you can change people, but planet is something bigger.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think some of the more interesting movements at the moment, the climate. I'm very interested in the kids standing up for climate now, the young people. I think it's a bit awful. It's a bit, you know, the Harry Potter books. What's wrong with the Harry Potter books is that the children have to fight the fight against evil. And at the moment I'm feeling a bit like the climate issue is like the Harry Potter books. The children have got to fight for climate change, which is a shame on my generation, really. I think one of the most interesting movements is the divestment. Bill McKibben divestment movement. They're getting everybody to stop putting money in fossil fuel industries. So they're getting, it's called divestment. So they're going from university to university and saying, are you, or to pension schemes or to insurances, and telling them pull their money out of fossil fuel. And they're having quite a bit of success, and putting the money into obviously clean, green jobs and alternatives. There's actually a lot of possibilities out there to move fast from dirty to clean. And the Paris agreements are not totally bad. They're still too slow, but...
I will precise my question. So is it... sorry, I don't know a lot about it, but is it like big companies who are polluting our planet, let's say, and society, or are there some companies who stand against those companies, like the division of the... And what are the companies who are on our side? I mean, like eco-activists. No, because movements, of course, it's...
Well, in the energy business, there are green energy companies. In the car industry and the banks at the moment, and the big oil companies, etc., are the baddies. That's clear. There's no, I wouldn't know one. I mean, Shell is my biggest hatred because they knew, and they didn't bother to change anything, and they're actually being held up by, they're in court in Holland now with Friends of the Earth for having known since the 80s and having kept it secret. There's a court case in Holland that was won to the Dutch government for not protecting its own citizens properly. That's been done by civil society again, though. But there are, I'm trying to think, I think in terms of the big companies, funnily enough, the Philips isn't too bad. They've moved more into solar and all that kind of thing. There's a lot of smaller startups. There's huge numbers who are looking for new technology and doing new things. But 12 years, as you say, is no time at all. It's no time at all. And the 12 years is not that the world will finish after 12 years, but it's that then we can't keep it under the 2 degrees. So the process of what's happening to the planet becomes an autonomous process which we can't influence anymore. So I actually think we're too late already. In that sense, I'm quite a somber. Yeah.
But what about Tesla? You didn't mention this electric cars and everything.
Well, of course. And
but he's world icon.
Tesla.
That Elon Musk and his company.
But he's in trouble too, isn't he, at the moment?
He is, but...
Yeah. No, and there are. I mean, it's the companies. It's our lifestyles. We can make choices, but I don't. I think the biggest thing that we need is government regulations. If the government just said only electric cars will drive through Europe in 10 years' time, that'll be fine. I mean, that will happen. And look what Volkswagen did, how they cheated. Every attempt to not make... So the rules have to be set by governments. But the governments are in the pocket of the big businesses. That's where part of that problem is. Yeah.
Час на останнє питання. Прошу, Віталій.
So, summarizing what has already been said, can you agree to the statement that human as a biological species is somehow self-destructible? And the other thing is that we see so many far-right politicians claiming that the global warming and this entire issue is just a hoax created to reduce the level of our progress. And have you had ever any thought that, for example, this destruction of our planet has already been triggered by the events which has happened throughout the centennial history of humans exploring the fossil fuel deposits and so on and so forth? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I happily I don't think it's our biological destiny to destroy ourselves. I think we as humans have choices to do better or to do worse. And I think certainly with the fossil fuel, and that's why the Greenpeace has worked so hard on all this kind of thing for the last 30, 40 years. We've done a bloody good job at causing a lot of trouble. And we say that any fossil fuel that's in the ground should stay in the ground now. So it shouldn't be pulled out. So in that sense, you're right. And you're right that there's very little time left. I think the anti-climate, the climate skeptics, they're like, for me, they're very clear. Go to any of the arguments of the tobacco industry, and you'll see exactly the same misinformation, bullshit arguments, lack of scientific, all that kind of stuff. The arguments against climate change have been. There's been a huge sponsorship from very rich people in America who've encouraged that. They did it with the tobacco industry, they do it with the arms industry, and they're doing it with climate. And they're actually also connected to pro-life, interestingly enough, which is where that's a whole connection, and it's all connected to certain religious positioning, and it's Trump's base. But they are very, very organized to try and dismantle the science. Now, the science is 99.9999999% clear, and anybody who bothers to look at it knows that, and any scientist who's worth his salt knows that. So because they couldn't fight it anymore, they've now got to fight. They've got to fight science and facts anyway. They're now trying to make everything into perceptions and opinions. Well, perceptions and opinions will get them space again. That's what they're trying to do. But I mean, our populist politicians in Holland are without a doubt getting finances that can be traced back to the Koch brothers in America, if somebody could trace it back, except they don't have to say where they get their finances. But there's a very good guy in Holland who followed the arguments against climate in the last 15, 20 years, and followed where they were going in America and where it was arriving in Europe and which parliament it was being mentioned. You could see exactly the same arguments coming through. So it's a very organized campaign. And now the disinformation that we're getting in elections, it's I don't know how that can be controlled. And I am optimistic that there's plenty of people like the people who are in this room who keep wanting to keep their independent brain about them and want to make their own judgments and don't want to be told by others what truth is and what isn't. So in that sense, I'm a human optimist. Although I think we're cutting it very fine in terms of the planet. And, I am very concerned about that. But we have actually, even in pollution and in other areas of climate, we have done a lot of things and have improved it again. And with the technologies are out there, funnily enough. What we need now, what our governments haven't been prepared to do, is just is just make rules. Like they made rules, no child labour, thank you very much. And let's now make rules, no fossil cars, thank you very much, you know. Let's just have a few clear rules out there. But that needs politicians who are not in the pocket of the big business and who dare to stick out their necks.
So, the last question.
Yeah, you have time. I have time. We've got 12 years.
Well, thank you also for starting this debate about climate change and global warming. I think it's a very, very important debate, but I think it's also much too big to cover it here now.
Yes.
That's why I would like to come back to the starting point of your story, but connected also with this debate. Because you said, like in the beginning, you fought for very specific things. You fought for changing certain rules, for changing legislation, yeah, which when you started, you had a specific aim.
Yep.
So I imagine that especially for young activists, young volunteers, this is very handy.
Yeah.
Because you have a clear aim, you are engaging for something very certain, you know how more or less how you could reach that.
Yep.
And maybe also you had some kind of instructions even. By now we would have instructions, we know where to start,
Yep.
what are the following up steps,
Yep.
and when we have completed this aim, then we can continue.
Yep.
So I was wondering if maybe from your point of view, the young people who are engaging in the Fridays for Future, for example, if they're not reaching out for too much, if they're not wanting too much for that moment, for their age, for their horizon.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Certainly it's true that in terms of a particular aim and a particular tactic and getting results, that's a very satisfying route. And both tactically and strategically you can do that. And that has been done by lesbian and gay movements around the world and by feminists around the world on particular issues. The young people depends on which young people. I mean, if I look at the young anti-gun movement in America, they've got big ambitions, and yet it's very clear they just want those guns out of their schools. You know, the climate. There's a girl, is it in Norway? I think a 16-year-old who's spoken out. Climate. I mean, she's got big aims, but it's true. It's true that it's easier to work for a particular goal and aim and get there. It'd be nice if we could connect the dots to the next ones and, you know, get going together. But maybe you're right. It's certainly it's satisfying to achieve a goal and to see a legislation change and to see. I mean, I've had a lot of opportunity to have quite concrete successes, and not just me, but when I was when I was running Oxfam Novib, when we were supporting 800 NGOs around the world, a lot of those NGOs managed to get quite concrete results and managed to move things forward in their countries. So you're right, it's nice to be able to go from A to B to C and then sit back and think, that's what we've achieved. It's just, there's gaps. And I think, and actually to be honest, I think the civil society, I thought we can play politics by staying in civil society, but we've got to get into politics as well. We've got to get good political representation. I've always been asked, why don't you go into politics? And I've always said, I don't like politicians very much. But I know, which is true, I don't like politicians very much, but I now think that's maybe a slightly weak excuse, because civil society can get me so far. Civil society can't get me to get fossil cars off the road. That has to be politicians who make those laws and rules. So, or the people themselves. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So, and the last question. Imagine. So what about you lot though? What about my then? What about what's happening on Sunday and what's happening? What's happening here? What are you going to do? Okay, we have a really nice experience of organizing Maidans in Ukraine, and if you are interested, we can share this experience. But we, you know.
Yeah, you said that we have still 20 years, but maybe we have no time anymore. So here in Ukraine, these 4 days till Sunday are accepted in the same way. We have no time anymore, but still we have 4 days. So now nobody knows, and I hope that that we still have 4 days, and everything will. And even if you are from Greenpeace, not everything in this planet will be green. And the last question. Imagine that tomorrow every newspaper and magazine in the world is being published with empty white first page, and there is the only one sentence, and this sentence is your personal quotation. What will be written there?
Be outraged, because that's the motor for change.
Дякуємо. Sylvia Borren.